Caleb is the public program manager at Toy Art for Experience Wellington. He is passionate about sharing the power and value of art in our communities, making him a joy and a terror at dinner parties. I didn't write that. When not talking about art, he is pursuing work towards the radical proposition that we all deserve and have the means to live a good life. So Caleb, looking forward to it. The floor is yours.
Great, I'll just get the screen up. That's the one. Awesome, so hopefully you can all now see my opening slide.
Yes,
great. So yeah, like just introduced, my name's Caleb Gordon. I'm the public program manager for art at City Gallery Wellington, but also across a whole lot of other little sites across Wellington. We've got a little family of cultural institutions, but my role is really about hosting public events and kind of just trying to find ways to invite people in so they kind of want to spend time in an art gallery, which can be a challenge the best sometimes, but also give you those ways of kind of engaging the art, those entry points, so that when you do visit an art gallery, you feel like it's a place that you want to spend time, that you want to understand, and actually kind of leave feeling enriched. So today I'm talking to you about kind of art's power to kind of tell stories and how we can use art to tell better stories about kind of ourselves and our kind of world around us. And part of this is because like I already been said, I think art is powerful. I think it can be affirming and challenging and transformative, along with kind of any other number of adjectives. And as such, we should apply art broadly, but with some care. And lately, the line I have been using a lot when I'm talking to people is, we need to tell better stories about art and art history. And so that's what I'm going to be taking you through today by looking at some recent exhibitions at City Gallery Wellington. And what really motivates me about this is art's very rarely about itself. It can be deeply personal to the artist making it, it can connect to current events, or it can be exploring, responding to kind of issues or ideas or beliefs. And as a result, art is always full of stories. And there's a number of reasons why we should be telling better stories with art professionally. I think we owe it to the art and artists that I should be doing this, and with all the art that's kind of brought into the care of my organization. But also I think it leads to a bit of an experience for all of you who might be looking at it. Telling better stories often places artworks in a more complex narrative, connecting them with broader conversations, and making a conversation bigger than the art in front of you offers that kind of richer, more textured experience and multiple ways into exploring that work. So that frame I often use when approaching artwork is that we're bringing art into conversation. So it's about opening up that dialogue so that when you're standing in front of artwork, it's not kind of a one-way relationship. It's what you're bringing to the artwork as well as what it's bringing to you, creating like a more complex and interesting situation. So I'm going to start with the first work, which is a series of photographs by Tia Wanganui, and it's from an exhibition we had last year called Gonville Gothic. And so Tia is an artist based in Wanganui who works deeply personal and really based in Wanganui. So her photographs kind of are taken exclusively around Wanganui, more precisely close to the river. She describes herself as having been growing up the river. She has whakapapas back to Marae up Wanganui River. So it's all about Wanganui, all about her experiences and how that connects with her place and identity there. I really love Tia's work because I think it's super playful. I think it's really textured and it kind of lures you in with some brightness and curiosity. And there's kind of layers in her work that kind of then reveal her strong voice, where she's trying to reclaim stories and question cultures. And so the series that we'll be looking at here with me today is a series called Tua O Ta Wow Wow, or Away with the Fairies. And it's a series from the kind of past 2 years. So it's quite recent. Tia's kind of in her middle age, but she's kind of recently become an artist. So that's also kind of an exciting thing about her, as she's suddenly exhibiting after kind of a number of years of kind of just making work privately and for herself. But this is a really fun series. So the series looks at these figures called Patupai Here, which the closest analogy we have are probably kind of fairies, if you think of kind of fairy stories from England and Europe. And so they're creatures that are said to kind of lived in the forest in the mists. And they're kind of playful trickster figures. They often move things around, but they're also said to kind of lure beautiful Māori woman into the forest. So, very much in that tradition of fairies from Europe. But the reason why T is playing with these figures is she really wants to kind of reclaim them, because she's seen them kind of misused recently, kind of this way of weaponizing Māori culture against kind of herself and kind of her family. And so they're said to be, the thing about Patupāhere is they're said to be these mythical creatures who live in the forest, but they're often described as being fair-haired and fair-skinned with blue eyes, kind of blonde hair. And often it's kind of said that if you're a Māori person with red hair, it's said to be it's a result of kind of a liaison between one of these creatures and someone. And so to Tia, these creatures aren't kind of myths or creatures of legend or myth. She grew up kind of in the forest or quite close to them around the Wanganui River, and members of her family have often talked about these stories of encountering them, particularly her cousins who are often out pig hunting. And they often describe encountering them as kind of a deeply creepy experience, but kind of like her and her family kind of accept them as kind of like living not far away, kind of in their own realm, kind of again similar to that kind of like a fairy mound that you might come across in Ireland. But the reason why Tia kind of brings them up is in recent years, questionable historians in New Zealand have used these stories of fair-skinned people who kind of lived in the forest to claim that there was European settlement in New Zealand before the arrival of Māori. And so as such, kind of using this as evidence to say that the Celtic people or Nordic seafarers kind of found and settled in New Zealand to kind of question or disregard Māori's claim to being Indigenous or to sovereignty to New Zealand. And it really flirts with notions of white supremacy and conspiracy, kind of the pseudoscience, which has real world impacts, because when these stories have been kind of reported in newspapers, they often say that they've dug up remains and sent them overseas for genetic testing or for facial reconstruction. And so they're essentially claiming to be grave robbing and kind of destroying Urupā. And so what Tia is really trying to do here is kind of reclaim these stories and the contemporary misappropriation and kind of remix them to tell a story in their own service to Māori people. And so you can see this this work we're looking at here, it's these two kind of red-headed figures in a boat, kind of the boat playing up the seafaring idea, but also this idea that this Patupāhere are kind of fierce-haired people. And she's kind of really...
Hello.
Yep. We can't see the images.
Oh, can you not?
We're just still on this first slide, yeah.
Hang on, how's that?
There we go.
There we go, wrong button. So here's the first image I was talking about. So here's the first kind of two images. There's this one of kind of this red-haired youth kind of lying in the mists on the ground here. And the second image of kind of two figures in a boat, kind of playing into this idea of these perhaps figures being part of a seafaring history. So it's Tia kind of remixing this or kind of questioning these stories that are being brought up against this kind of Māori legend. And I think these works are really interesting because it's kind of Tia updating kind of folklore and bringing it into the contemporary moment. She's bringing these kind of legendary figures out of the forest and into the urban environment of Wanganui, which is kind of why we've called it Gonville Gothic. And I think this work is particularly interesting and quite hilarious. So like in this one, she's kind of, retelling a classic tale of kind of abduction or luring a maiden out into the forest, but in a really updated contemporary way. And here you've kind of got this kind of red-haired Patupāhere figure who's kind of come out of the forest, but he's cruised down in his Mustang, so he's using the muscle car to kind of lure the Māori maiden away. And so she's kind of being quite playful and kind of fast and easy with this folklore to kind of make it relevant and bring it into kind of a contemporary narrative that people can kind of see and understand. And I think the works like this are also really interesting because, like I was saying, Tia's work's quite often really personal about being around Wanganui. This is shot in her backyard. She's borrowed her neighbour's car. The red-haired youth is actually her best friend's son, and the young Māori woman in the car is her niece. And just on the other side of the fence is actually the Wanganui River. So there's also like these layers of place and community. Like it plays a really big part in the work Tia makes. So really constructed, but everything involved is kind of some type of relationship. So even when you start to look at the process behind her work, it really plays up the fact that she's all about her place in her community. And so this is a like really, straightforward example of the way her work all plays together in this way. This kind of updating it for a kind of updating the myth for kind of a suburban Wanganui treatment. And then like you've got these other works here. So part of the trick as well, like in this previous image, you kind of had the smoke coming out of the car, the idea of this, that this is the mist they live in. All the other images have this kind of mist or the smoke existing around them. She actually created this by just having everyone she's photographing use the vape pens, which can produce huge amounts of smoke. So she's also finding these clever, playful ways to kind of bring this idea of if these figures or creatures need the mist to survive or hide in, there's a way you can pull that through into the contemporary environment. But I love this one particularly, just because there's something like really uncanny about it. She talks about the experience of her family encountering them in the forest, but there's something kind of unusual about this that you could kind of imagine walking down a street and kind of seeing this out of the corner of your eye and being like, that's a bit weird, and kind of turning back and maybe they're not there again, really playing up this idea that you could have these strange and uncanny encounters in that in your everyday environment. And so I think it's just really playful. And I love this house as well. It kind of has that gingerbread house kind of vibe from European fairy tales as well. I just think Tia's always got this kind of clever eye to see there's that little moments that you could really kind of spin out into like a bigger story. And so I really think Tia's works just kind of really amazing. I think that she kind of weaves together these really interesting number of ideas. She often is really has a light touch to surface these really big conversations, but also finds a way to tell us about herself as well. The kind of works that you like I said, they're curious. You kind of have it stand in front of them and try and unpick them a bit. And as you start to kind of pull those conversations out, you realize she's thinking about these really big ideas and these kind of really wanting to get into a juicy conversation, but through like a really kind of attractive and bright and colorful entry point. And I think it's just like it's weaving this all together to kind of take something kind of old, something, these myths, folklore, big conversations around who we are as a nation, but also placing them quite at home with her in Wanganui. And this idea of, how you might play out in contemporary lives. I think it's just an example of how an artist is using, a really straightforward photographic practice, because that's something quite unusual about Tia, is she just literally points her camera and shoots. She doesn't do any touch-ups. Whatever we see on the wall in her photograph is what she captured in camera. She doesn't mess around with After Effects, and that's partly because she didn't go to art school herself. So she's just using what she taught herself. But she's really interesting, just kind of opening up conversations with these really compelling little photographs. And I think and partly as well, like you really get the sense that they're important to her and her family. This isn't just folklore, but it's lived experience. So she's trying to find a way to bring this lived experience to life in some ways, to capture it, so that when other people look at these photographs, they understand there's still this living culture, there's still this thing happening. And so, and I think so there's this, like the fun and playful, but there's this idea of challenge in her work. And there's these other, some of the other works that you'll see from her, like often have this kind of quite a confronting and challenging moment inside them. These are the only works I have from her, and she's quite a fresh artist, so there's not a whole lot of work around, but she does have this other amazing series where she's Tia's kind of challenging protocols in Māori culture, where she, particularly this idea around tapu, where Tia photographs herself breaking tapu, and she's really questioning these ideas of tapu's existed for a number of kind of generations and centuries, and maybe is there still a purpose for this in our contemporary society? Why do we still follow these rules and guidelines? So she's kind of playing around in lots of different spaces with her artwork, and she produces these really punchy moments and conversations. So do keep an eye out for her, because I know her work is kind of popping up in different places at the moment, because everyone kind of wants to show some of these works. But moving along to the next kind of artwork piece we'll be looking at, we'll stay with humor, but we'll be looking at a video artwork. So I can only show you screenshots from it. But it's a work called Casualties of Modernity by Kent Muckman. And we had this exhibit as part of a group exhibition called Every Artist, which was actually just a whole lot of artworks that in some way engage with art history or told a story about art history. So in some ways it was artists doing the work of kind of curators and art historians for us. So it became, that was quite fun because it was immediately entering into a conversation with artists. And I have to be honest, this is probably one of my favorite works I've seen in the past few years. I think it's super nerdy. It's kind of engages with art history in a really interesting way, but it's also incredibly funny. And I love a bit of humor in art because I think art's kind of too important to take itself too seriously. But this work is a short video. I think you can actually find it online because it's hosted on a website, which is quite wonderful if you wanted to look it up afterwards. And it kind of runs like a mock TV soap opera. So it's coming kind of between Days of Our Lives and maybe ER or Grey's Anatomy. So it's kind of all about what's happening in a hospital. And in this work, Miss Chief Eagle Testicle, who's an alter ego of Kent Muckman, the artist, who often creates work under this guise. He comes from the Cree Nation, so his identity as a Native American comes into play a lot in his work. He tours a hospital ward that's caring for the casualties of modernity or modern art. And so as the chief is guided around, they're guided by the Doctor of Fine Arts. So again, playing on this idea of who gets to say what art history is and the authority we give to medical doctors. And they're introduced to all these patients who are vulnerable or forgotten art traditions and are often manifesting some affliction or condition that threatens their welfare. And so on her arrival, romanticism in the form of a nude male is kind of declared dead, arguably the last kind of art movement of figurative painting. The chief then kind of goes through, encounters all these different other art movements suffering due to their form. She encounters patient Zero, who's a bedpan signed Mutt, which is a reference to Marcel Duchamp's infamous fountain, which was a urinal that he just entered into an art competition and then signed. She encounters an empty bed, which is said to be conceptualism, where conceptualism is just there suffering but unseen. Under a sheet that's pulled back is the death of painting, which is just a blank canvas, but declared dead. And then there's a locked ward with a whole lot of screaming and strange behavior happening, which is where they've kind of isolated all the performance art. And so it's this really kind of ludicrous situation, but it plays like a TV sitcom. So kind of like a TV sitcom, you can't help but sit there the whole way through and not look away. But in the scene I've got in front of you here, the chief is seen consoling what has become of the female nude. And so the female nude's body has become kind of so contorted and abstracted that she can barely breathe. And so she's there in the hospital on kind of like life support to help her breathe and keep, kind of just basically keep this particular movement alive. And so while she's there kind of holding this art for the female nude's hand, she's kind of pontificating about the greatness of the female nude and how she entered the sorry state and kind of perhaps her greatness will return. There's a lot of kind of ironic wit behind this particular artwork, simply because there's this, the chief comes in as this kind of caring and compassionate celebrity who's kind of there to offer a little bit of like kind of support and guidance. But because she's there as this figure of kind of indigenous knowledge and power, she's kind of challenging these Eurocentric, patriarchal, heteronormal Western art traditions, which for centuries have kind of treated other cultures like Native Americans, like the Māori people in New Zealand, as kind of sick or dying and in need of salvation from kind of Western art or Western traditions, but also ripe exploitation. So something like this female figure, the head resembling kind of North African masks or sculpture, which the kind of early modernists really kind of adopted as this new form to explore and play with. And so kind of Kent Muckman's kind of reversed the usual narrative through kind of his own perspective as a queer Indigenous artist, kind of using camp and humor and mimicry, which are kind of all strategies that you don't often see used in contemporary art because it's often seen as kind of low forms of art or lesser. So undeserving to be in an art gallery. And so in some ways, so Monkman's kind of turning all of the things that you would normally see in an art gallery into kind of the primary piece of this artwork. And it's kind of, and so this is the final scene where, like I said, the beginning of the movie, this is Romanticism who's declared dead, this kind of last figurative painting form, where she goes to see the body in the morgue and kind of revives this figure, and they kind of leave out of this triumphant moment. But here she collects and kind of despair that this is how the art world has kind of ended, with this figurative painting kind of lost. And then outside of video art, Kent Muckman actually is a figurative painter himself and produces these huge oil canvases, kind of reimagining key historical events in American history. So quite personal to him in some ways. But kind of like through this work in some ways with Kent coming in as chief testicle, he's basically suggesting that the problems inside Western art traditions can only be solved through kind of Indigenous thinking or Indigenous healing, which is again reversing this idea that Indigenous cultures are suffering and dying, and therefore you need Western art to come in and kind of revive them. And so it's kind of, there's a lot of like wit and edge and casualties for modernity that questions why do we always tell stories in history from the point of view that's kind of from point of view of kind of Europe or North America, this kind of Eurocentric way of understanding the world. And actually, if we brought in perspectives from outside there, kind of like Indigenous people, or even perspectives from New Zealand, we're very much on the edge of the world when it comes to things like art history. What kind of better stories could we tell, or what better ways of understanding or seeing things might we kind of be able to pull out of the stories that we're currently telling, and kind of what spaces could we open up to telling a different story or different perspective on things like the history of art history or the history of modernism. And in some ways as well, I think this work's really brilliant in it because it kind of offers this really accessible history of art or history of modernity in some ways, because in the work, it's this kind of fast and memorable tour of modern art, but all of them represented as kind of patients in the hospital. So I think it's also a really great tool for teaching art history to people who don't know kind of what's happened in the past century. Let me just check my time. I think I'm good. Might just skip over Mariana Simnett, just so I can spend more time on Helmer. But if we've got time, I might come back to it. It's a far darker artwork than the other two, which are quite funny. But the big thing that we've done in the past year at City Gallery is our exhibition, Helmer af Klint, The Secret Paintings. It was kind of our summer blockbuster show we had on since December last year. And it's kind of reinserting this figure of Helmer af Klint into art history. Helmer was an exceptionally exciting artist for us to exhibit, and we were kind of incredibly excited to kind of share her work with New Zealand, because she's kind of like the hottest topic in art history at the moment. Any other art gallery anywhere else in the world would have swapped with us in a heartbeat to take the show away and take the work, because everyone wants to be showing her work, which is interesting for an artist whose kind of last work was in the 1940s. Like, she's almost a century old, but she's absent from art history. And it's because Helmer painted some of the most original abstract works in the 20th century. And she deliberately removed herself from art history because at her death, she left a testament saying her work was to be locked away for 2 decades after her death. And so it's kind of been a slow reveal over the past 80 years to kind of get her work back out from storage, but also for art historians to take her seriously, to understand the importance and impact that she had on this moment, because she basically disappeared at her death. And so, but she kind of produced some of the most kind of revealing and innovative work in Western art history, and like kind of should be remembered in the same way that we remember kind of Mondrian or Kandinsky or Picasso as these great innovators in modern art. And so this is just, it's always nice to see a photo of the artist. This is Helmer in her studio from sometime in the 1880s. And I always like this photograph because you kind of see her not as a painter, but as a thinker. So you can really believe she had this kind of strong innovative spirit. She's kind of got her hand on her head like the Rodin thinker sculptor. So kind of showing that she is this kind of force to be reckoned with. Because Helmer didn't consider herself more than an artist. She considered herself, while she created these incredible paintings, she thought of herself as not just an artist, but as a writer and a medium and a mystic, which is also this idea that she was a mystic, which is why she's been difficult to bring back into art history. but so people often talk about Helmer as this innovative abstraction, but it's my belief that she's not just an innovator in abstraction. We should think of her as someone who innovated in abstraction again and again, because when we look at her paintings she's best known for, her paintings for the temple, you can see a number of different styles where she's trying different ways to abstract work, really pushing beyond kind of the existing figurative painting in Sweden at the time that she was painting, in Europe more widely. So this is just an example of her kind of abstraction. And these works are from I've only just finished these tours, 1907. So really early on, kind of well before we really expect to see abstraction Western art, and kind of huge canvases, as you can see from the photo of my colleagues in this one. Huge works that she kind of created in isolation without kind of a wide community around her supporting her. But like, it's not just these works. Every kind of series she creates, kind of year after year, shows a new form of innovation. And so early on, she was basically working with a small group of other women, working in this kind of mystic way of creating work, where she, and kind of at this moment in kind of the late 1900s, early 20th century, where they would get together once a week and go through kind of a spiritualist seance session together and connect with these higher powers who would present them these abstract forms to try and communicate back. And so this is very early Helmer with her collaborators kind of creating this new abstract language well before we can see any other evidence really of other artists kind of experimenting with abstraction. But basically, part of the project that we're doing with the Helmer af Klint secret paintings is trying to write her back into art history, try and show that she does warrant a place in the story because of her abstract innovation. But I think we can tell a way better story by saying she didn't just abstract once, she innovated again and again with each new piece of work. And so the first set of works that we often talk about is this series here, which we call Primordial Chaos, where you can kind of see this is her kind of first attempt at abstraction. I'll zoom in on one of them actually, and here's one actually from, she sketched it and then painted it. And so she's basically moved away from this idea of figuration. She's just kind of taking forms and just kind of making them quite organic, kind of twisting them. But as you can see in this long shot, there's kind of lines and text in them as well. So she's kind of pulling in all these ideas. It's not just about a figure that you can see and recognize, like perhaps a spiral shell, but also just kind of forms encountering each other, diagrammatic ideas. You can kind of like, she might be trying to teach you something, and just also putting text on the canvas. And these are all things that no one had ever really seen in painting Western art before. So in this kind of first attempt, she's really just kind of throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. And after this, she kind of begins to kind of refine her style as she moves through. So after Primordial Chaos, she moves into another next series, which we call the Seven Pointed Star series. And so here you can kind of see she's reduced back. She's now just playing with form, but this is only kind of a year after Primordial Chaos. And the style's often really been said to kind of be influenced by organic forms, and kind of often people also describe these as being quite dark and solemn compared to some of kind of the brightness and energy seen in other works. We then move on to the 10 Largest, which is one of her best known series. Again, this is kind of like the year after or just before. And these are incredible. From the other image, you can see they're over 3 meters tall. They're filled with kind of joyful and playful elements that appear to be kind of in motion. Everything's kind of moving and floating and kind of spinning and swirling, kind of almost merging together. Everything's in motion. And there's this kind of really, this concern here is kind of about how do we connect, how things are connecting and moving. And I think you can kind of see this idea in all of her work, that everything's always connecting and moving and coming together. But like it looks, you know, you can kind of see it might be in the family of the previous two works, but it's still its own different kind of language of abstraction. And then we move on to the next series kind of later, which is called the Swan series. And this is a form that does have figuration in it, but also kind of abstracts quite a way into kind of really pure forms. And so in these ones, the compositions become quite geometrical, quite symmetrical, quite rigid at first glance. But then when you spend time with them, you can kind of start to unpick organic forms in them. People often refer to this one as kind of You can see this an organic form, like it might be an atom or a nucleus of kind of a basic organism. But also this is the kind of work that people point to, saying this is what abstraction looks like. This is the abstraction that we talk about in art history and in our museums. And moving on from the Swan, we move on to other later series called the Dove and the Altarpieces. And here we're kind of still playing in geometrical and symmetrical kind of ideas, but they kind of start to feel a bit more cosmic. They feel like they're reminiscent of kind of planets or the sun or pyramids and lotus. They kind of become a lot more spiritual, actually connecting with spiritual motifs and decoration, but not so much in Europe, but from the East. And then this kind of last series that she kind of really did was called The Tree of Knowledge. And this one I think is really interesting, and you don't often see much of, because it kind of looks like she's playing with lots of geometric, organic forms again that she's pulling through, but less abstract and more pulled from the real world. These kind of look like they could be brains or kind of jellyfish, or even mushrooms. You can kind of see this far more interesting kind of dualism, this idea of kind of black and white, or kind of upper and lower, really split out. And again, dualism being this idea that plays up in her work. And like I can see, Helmer's a really exciting artist because she's hitting the internet art world really hard. And it's this idea that we need to make it part of art history again. And it's a curious thing in art history where it's really difficult to rewrite the history we already have existing. Once we've kind of said this is the way things happened, if we discover something new or we see a fact's a bit more complex than perhaps we've recorded it in our kind of written histories or the way we display exhibitions, people are really resistant to rewriting what we've already said is how it happened. But Helmer is kind of so innovative and so big that people can't kind of ignore her anymore. And so it's really pushing to say that we need to rewrite art history. We need to actually make the story more complex. And I think the nice thing with Helmer is if we can use Helmer to do this, say, actually, we need to rewrite art history and to say this is how modernism happened with this woman who was really innovative and working in isolation. And it should make space and should set that precedence where we can therefore start to rewrite art history more regularly, and we do start to find other people who've perhaps been missed or like deliberately omitted from art history because it just wasn't in the best interests of someone that they be present. And so Helmer's this really interesting character or figure who might let us actually have the opportunity to really rewrite what we're doing. I also think because she's this artist whose work has this really heavy mystic and spiritual element to it, it also will allow us to perhaps start to think of artists as more complex than just someone who makes the work in front of them. Because if we look at other early modernists like Mondrian or Kandinsky, we often just talk about them as these artists who kind of were innovative in the abstraction and created this new way of painting. But we know that they are more complex, that they were actually quite spiritually influenced. They were reading the same kind of texts and experiences that Helmer was having. But when we move things into an art gallery and museum, we kind of want to sanitize it. So we remove the things that are hard, like spiritualism. But Helmer kind of demands that we hold that with her work. So she actually might be, again, a figure that kind of demands that we kind of think harder about the way we tell art history or the way we talk about particular artists. I think that's the last, I left this as my last one. But this is basically, I think this particular Swan work is particularly interesting because it does, as one of those ones you can use to start fights with art historians around what came first and what abstraction looks like, which is always fun. I like starting fights with art historians, at least. It's fun for me. But, like I think these are just some really interesting examples of how a very kind of straight, plain looking work can have these really complex histories that you can kind of pull out and twist and play with. But I'll stop talking for a minute and wait for any questions you might have.
Well, thank you, Caleb. That's fantastic. Really fascinating. We've got some questions here, which I'll go through first of all. From Mick, does it help to know the artist and their background to understand what they are portraying?
I feel like the answer to all these questions is going to be, it depends.
Yeah.
I always find it's really, like, it offers it always offers a different perspective to understand where an artist is coming from or what they might be thinking. I think someone like Tia is really interesting because you can, I think, just appreciate them as kind of really playful and interesting artworks. And even if you, and even kind of expanding a bit further and connecting with some of the bigger stories around kind of the way particular parts of Māori folklore are being represented in the media. Or she also has a really interesting series about the Wanganui Māori Club, or I think it was the Savage Club for a while, which has its own really complex history as a museum, the performance venue, which, you know, can offer more into the work. And then knowing more about Tia can really make it that deep in your understanding of the work, because as soon as you start talking to Tia, you start understanding that she is someone who's really connected with her place as someone who was born in Wanganui and whose family has been there for generations. Because I was talking to her when she was exhibiting the work, and I was like, well, you know, all of these photographs you take are literally around Wanganui River. Do you take photographs anywhere else? And she was talking about traveling internationally. She even take a camera with her because she has no interest of taking photographs or creating work when she's not in her place that feels like home to her. So those type of things kind of, when you kind of hear kind of personal anecdotes like that and kind of that little bit of biography from an artist, it does kind of, I suppose, give the work a bit more gravity, but it doesn't necessarily change the meaning behind it. And same with Helmer, you can really appreciate her works as this fantastic innovations in painting and abstraction. And you don't need to really connect with any of the mystic or spiritual stuff. But when you do connect with the fact that she's a mystic and she was exploring spiritualism and what that meant for a woman at that time, and how that, you know, how that really influenced her creation of the work, it obviously kind of blows her work out and makes it that much more kind of rich and textured. So yeah, it's a definite maybe.
Okay. This is from Kate. What other aspects of fairies are common between Māori and European concepts of fairies?
That again, I suppose it's the Patupahere. I mean, it's just that fairies are the easiest analogy for me to reach for it, and it's also, I've heard other like, it's a way that Tia's explained the work. It's the way other Māori artists have explained who they are in folklore. But you know, like it's interesting that they are these figures that have these really similar kind of traits, that they live in the forest, they're nocturnal. They're kind of tricksters. They like to move things, because there's stories of them like, if you put something down, they'll move it away from you, or you should around it somewhere else. Or also this idea that they might take children the same way European fairies take children. The same way, again, like, you know, that they might abduct people the same way you hear about fairies abducting particular people and they disappear into a fairy mound somewhere. So there's just that thing where it's, you know, like folklore across the world, you can quite often find similar figures no matter where you're looking. The same way you kind of have the same hero story for a lot of culture heroes, the same way like Maui is a culture hero, and the same way that Prometheus is a culture hero for the Greeks, and the way they kind of, you know, steal fire or help mankind out in some way. Maui being a demigod is quite an analogy to come from someone like Hercules. So there's always, you know, you can always find that they never quite match, but there's the same kind of ingredients always seem to make up the same, you know, figures in our kind of global folklore, which is I always just find fascinating, and it's a nice way to kind of understand who these figures might be and better, you know, just kind of make it that richer experience.
From Anne, how do you choose artists for your exhibitions? Are you dependent on what is offered, or can you take a style or theme and build an exhibition?
I rely on curators for that, so I don't get to pick anything, unfortunately. If I did, I might pick some different things, which is, you know, our gallery is, City Gallery is quite interesting in that we are really curatorial driven and really project driven. We don't actually collect art. We don't have a collection to display or lean on. Most other contemporary art galleries do, so you can always have that kind of collection show where they can bring out what they've bought recently, what the highlight of the collection is. Whereas we really focus on contemporary art that's also brand new. A lot of the work we have is kind of fresh out of the studio. Sometimes the paint is still wet, and it means that often we're seeing it for the first time along with the visitors. So when it's someone like me who has to start talking about the work within about a week of it going up, I have a really steep learning curve often. They'll be like, how am I going to talk about this? What does this look like? But yeah, it all depends. Like sometimes you want to work with an artist because you see they're doing something new and innovative. Sometimes you want to work with an artist because they are fresh. At the moment, we've just opened new shows on Saturday at the gallery. One called Tilia, which are two recent graduates from Massey University who've kind of been graduates for a couple of years and kind of have really interesting ways of working. One's a photographer and one works in installation art and sculpture. And so two very different ways of making and quite different approaches to what the messages they're trying to talk about, but somehow there's this shared interest in kind of an experience. And the fact that they're both kind of recent graduates is why they kind of got put together, because they were both people our curator wanted to work with. And then the other show is one, we've actually got a guest curator coming in, Shannon Tiao, who teaches at Massey University here in Wellington, who's also an artist in his own right, called Maturo. And it's a show he's been kind of working on for a while, talking to the gallery about, and it's kind of brought together a whole lot of new work, which is always really exciting, of Māori artists that kind of show a way of art making and practice. It's all about how your lived experience is kind of flows into your art practice and vice versa. So this idea that you don't just create work kind of in isolation. Your work is influenced by your life, and the work you're making can influence your way you live your life as well. And it's also really exciting because it's like an intergenerational show. There's works from like Emily Kalaka, and who's kind of like a senior Māori artist who's kind of well known, whose work everyone's probably seen at some point. So again, like an artist who's only graduated recently and he really hasn't had a gallery show before. So it's also this idea of kind of creating a show that brings artists into conversation across generations. And the theme there is just basically that all these artists are Māori and they've kind of creating work that's quite interesting. So there's like endless approaches to it, but it's the curator's job to do that. So he basically spends his life looking at art and trying to make interesting connections.
Yep. So this exhibition is coming up next, is it?
It's opened on Saturday, last Saturday. So it's been open now 3 days.
Yeah.
And in 2 weeks' time, we open another show with Glenn Hayward, who's also actually a Wanganui-based artist, and it's kind of a mid-career survey looking at, well, it's not even a mid-career survey. It's just looking at all the work he's created over the past decade and kind of bringing all of it together to see what you can kind of make of putting it in one space together. Because sometimes you don't see that until you bring it together as well. So yeah, it's also that nice thing where it's like, up until for the past 3 months, we've had Helmer F. Clint installed, big international artist, big blockbuster show, an old artist as well. She's interesting in being an historic artist, but we treated her like a contemporary project because no one had seen the work before. And now we've done the switch where suddenly we're filling our gallery with a whole lot of local artists that's kind of brand new work as well. So it's kind of flipping the script sometimes, that's also what we try to do as well. If we've got an artist who might be local, the next show we'll try and maybe bring someone who's not local. So there's always that variety there as well. It's kind of the real pleasure of being project-based.
The Helmer exhibition, Helen's just said that she really loved it and lovely to revisit it today. The staff and I went along just before Christmas and saw you there, Caleb, and we visited the exhibition. I wouldn't normally go to an art gallery. So what impact, I guess, does having a big blockbuster show like that have on future exhibitions? For someone like me, I guess.
Well, part of it is blockbuster shows are always like we always call them blockbusters because you do all the marketing around it, you put the extra effort into it. And often it means we're trying to make someone pay entry as well, because normally we're free. So putting a ticket on the door is always a risk. But for someone like me who's really interested in visitors, I really want to use those big shows as a more accessible way to come into the gallery. Like you kind of get that buzz going, you want everyone talking about it. So people who visit us who maybe haven't visited the gallery for a while, might come back. People who haven't been before, this is your excuse to come. And we really want to kind of like use that moment to hook you in and make you kind of a really interested and dedicated art viewer. So kind of you have that confidence to come back. You're not afraid to come to art gallery, because I think there is that real threshold fear of coming into spaces, particularly contemporary art galleries, and then being like, actually, you can come in and you don't need to have done any prior reading, you can just enjoy yourself. So really we want to use those shows to kind of convert people into art lovers, but also it's that chance to really share like a big international art moment with a local audience. In New Zealand, we don't get to see it that often. We don't have like historical art collections like you'll find through other countries because we just don't have that history or that history of collecting. So it's also really wonderful when we can share that with our local audience, especially after COVID when no one was going anywhere. And then there wasn't an international audience coming to see the show because it was also the only time it'd been shown in kind of Asia Pacific. It was open for 2 weeks in Sydney before it closed. And so we were the only venue in the Southern Hemisphere essentially to get Helmer. And now it's all gone back to Sweden. So it was kind of the one shot to get it to it before otherwise you have to visit Sweden.
Do you know how many visitors you had in total?
It was a really big number, I can tell you that. I don't want to say it, but in case I've got to get it wrong, I'll get in a lot of trouble from someone for reporting it an error.
No,
but everyone was very happy with the numbers we got, so that was the main thing.
Great. Helen says, is the current closure of the Wanganui Sargent Art Gallery meaning that there are more artists from Wanganui looking for a suitable gallery to exhibit?
I'm not sure, actually. I think it's just pure luck. We've been working with a lot of artists from Wanganui lately. So yeah, we actually, our curator saw her work in New Plymouth when he was up there checking out something else and happened to walk past a smaller gallery that was exhibiting some of her photographs and kind of one of them was like, this is great. I've never seen this before. Who is she? And then kind of tracked her down to Wanganui. And so that was kind of a New Plymouth angle. And who is it? We've got Glenn Haywood. You know, he's an established artist. He's grew up in Wanganui. He does kind of large sculpture works, a lot of wood carving. So I think he's probably just got, the space there to do that. But it's just, it's those existing relationships. But, it's always that thing where artists in New Zealand are really well networked, so they kind of get in front of you no matter any way they can. But I imagine if you are an artist in Wanganui right now, you probably are hunting around for places to show work since you don't get to have the Sargent currently.
That's great. I think that's the end of our question list. Really appreciate that, Caleb. Just before I hand over to Kirsten to say thank you, Kate says, thank you, Caleb. Your talk was very interesting. Modern work can be quite difficult to understand, and I appreciate your insights. So I think that's a great summary, actually.
Yeah, and that's really what I was trying to get across is you don't need to be afraid of contemporary artwork. And I feel like I understand that it can be difficult to contend with. I often have the same experience. It takes me a while to warm to some things, but it's just more like come in and spend some time with it. And you only need to start with standing in front of it and kind of having that kind of wow moment and working out what it physically looks like. And the meaning can come afterwards. You don't need to come with meaning. You just need to spend time with an artwork.
I'll hand over to Kirsten now. She's our social connection coordinator for Wellington and Porirua. Kirsten, I'll pin you. Hang on a second. There we are.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Caleb. That was awesome. I'm very privileged every month to go to the Wellington City Art Gallery and spend time with Caleb. Every time I come away, except for maybe seeing Helmer for 4 times in a row, every other time I come away, I think, wow, that's amazing. I learned something about a piece of art that's on the wall that if I didn't have Caleb there talking to me, I would be like, what the heck is that? So I'm really appreciative of you, Caleb. Your talk was fantastic as always. I really recommend all of you, if you get a chance, to come to our monthly Age Concern Art Gallery gatherings. The next one's on the 19th of May, and you'll get to see, I guess, some of the Tia, can't remember her surname. Sorry.
No, we'll be looking at Mataro next time we get together.
Yeah.
And interestingly, we've got Tia's daughter has an artwork in that show. So
oh, cool.
We will be looking at some Wanganui work, but it's Ming Wanganui, not Tia.
Okay. You can hang around later and go and look at that stuff yourself if you want to. But yeah, I really recommend that you go onto our website and find my phone number and or email address and let me know if you want to come along. We have limited spaces, about 12 spaces, and we have some afternoon tea in the cafe next door afterwards. So yeah, Caleb's fantastic at really demystifying, I guess, what you're seeing in front of you. So thanks so much, Caleb. That was awesome.